They laughed. Not quietly. Not under their breath. They laughed the way people laugh when they think they're completely safe, when they believe the person in front of them has no power, no recourse, and no idea what they're walking into. They were wrong about all three. This is the story of Marcus Wade. The day he walked into a Manhattan boardroom in steel-toed work boots, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a silence that would change every single life in that room forever. Stay with me. Because I promise you, by the end of this story, you will never look at another person the same way again. Before we get to that boardroom, you need to understand who Marcus Wade is. Not the version the newspapers printed. Not the version his enemies whispered about at cocktail parties. The real version. Marcus Raymond Wade was born on a Tuesday morning in February 1974 in Youngstown, Ohio, a city that, by the time Marcus arrived, had already started losing its fight with economic decline. The steel mills that had built Youngstown into a proud industrial powerhouse were closing, one by one, like candles being snuffed out in a darkening room. The city that had once hummed with the sound of American industry now hummed with something else: uncertainty. His mother, Dolores Wade, was 22 years old when Marcus was born. She worked 2 jobs, a morning shift at a diner on Market Street and an evening shift cleaning offices downtown. She was, by every definition, a force of nature. Short, sturdy, with hands that were always slightly raw from cleaning chemicals and dishwater, Dolores Wade was the kind of woman who never asked for sympathy and never accepted defeat. She taught Marcus 3 things before he was old enough to go to school: how to make his bed tight enough that a quarter would bounce off it, how to look every person in the eye when they spoke to you, and how to work. Work is not a punishment, she told him once, when he complained about being too tired to help her fold laundry at 10:30 at night. Work is how you tell the world you're still here. Marcus never forgot that. His father, Raymond Wade, Ray, everyone called him, was a construction worker. A good one. The kind of man other workers respected, the foreman's foreman, the guy who always showed up first and left last. Ray Wade had arms like dock rope and a laugh that could fill a gymnasium. He wore steel-toed boots every single day of his working life, boots so worn and scuffed and resoled so many times that Marcus once joked they were practically a family heirloom. These boots, Ray would say, knocking them together over the back porch railing at the end of a long day, have walked 1,000,000 honest miles. Marcus grew up watching his father come home dirty and tired and completely, unshakably proud. He wanted to be exactly like him. And then, when Marcus was 14 years old, everything changed. Ray Wade died on a job site on a Wednesday in October. He was 41 years old. He had been working on a commercial building renovation project, an old warehouse being converted into retail space on the edge of downtown Youngstown. A structural beam that should have been secured properly gave way. Ray didn't have time to move. The investigation afterward found 3 separate safety violations on that site. The company, a mid-size regional contractor called Hartwell Construction, paid a fine. A fine that amounted to less than the cost of 1 month's liability insurance for a business their size. They sent a bouquet of white lilies to the funeral. Dolores accepted them without expression. Later that night, Marcus found them in the trash. He didn't cry at his father's funeral. Not because he wasn't devastated, he was. He was 14 and the most important person in his world had just been taken from him for reasons that had nothing to do with fate and everything to do with someone's carelessness and greed. He didn't cry because his mother wasn't crying. Dolores Wade stood at that graveside like a lighthouse, upright, unflinching, throwing out just enough light to keep her children from drowning in the dark. Marcus had a younger sister, Janelle, who was 9. He made a decision at that graveside. He looked down at his father's casket, and then he looked at his sister, and then he looked at his mother's profile against the gray Ohio sky, and he made a quiet, unspoken, absolute promise. He would never let them struggle. Not for a single day longer than he could help it. The years after Ray's death were hard in ways that are difficult to describe to people who have never experienced that particular kind of hardship, the hardship that doesn't announce itself dramatically but just grinds. The quiet indignity of checking prices before putting things in a grocery cart. The way Marcus learned to time his growth spurts against the school year so his mother wouldn't have to buy new clothes twice. The Saturday mornings he spent doing odd jobs for neighbors, mowing lawns, raking leaves, shoveling snow, pressing the folded bills into his mother's hand every Sunday evening like a small and insufficient offering. He wasn't bitter about it. That's the part people always got wrong about Marcus when they read about him later. They assumed that the hardship made him angry, that he was fueled by resentment, that his success was revenge. It wasn't. The hardship made him precise. It taught him the exact value of everything. Time, money, trust, effort, loyalty. Marcus Wade understood the weight of each of those things in a way that people who grow up comfortable never quite do. He graduated high school with a 3.8 GPA despite working 20 hours a week for the last 2 years of it. He had a partial academic scholarship to Youngstown State, but he deferred it for 2 years. He couldn't afford the gap even with the scholarship, and Janelle was 11, and his mother's knees were starting to give her trouble from years of standing on diner floors. He got a job in construction instead. He started as a laborer, the bottom of the food chain, doing whatever nobody else wanted to do. Hauling materials, cleaning sites, mixing concrete, doing prep work. He worked for a small local contractor named Pete Garza, who was gruff and demanding and, Marcus would later say in every interview he ever gave, one of the 3 or 4 most important people in his life. Pete Garza saw something in Marcus in the first 2 weeks. He couldn't have told you exactly what it was. An attentiveness, maybe. An unusual quality of observation, the way Marcus watched everything, absorbed everything, asked the right questions at the right moments and stayed quiet the rest of the time. Pete started walking Marcus through things. The business side of things. How bids worked. How contracts were structured. How the cascade of liability flowed through a project from owner to general contractor to subcontractor. How the good money wasn't in swinging the hammer, it was in knowing exactly which hammer needed to be swung, by whom, for how much, and why. Marcus listened to every word like he was memorizing scripture. He was 21 when he enrolled at Youngstown State. By then he had saved enough to cover what the scholarship didn't. He worked full-time through every semester. He studied business and finance. He graduated in 5 years instead of 4 because he had to slow down twice when life intervened, once when his mother had knee surgery, and once when Janelle needed help with a situation that Marcus has never discussed publicly but that cost him a semester and every dollar he had saved above his tuition. He graduated. He walked across that stage in a suit that didn't quite fit because he'd bought it second-hand, and his mother and his sister were in the 3rd row, and when he found their faces in the crowd, his mother was wearing an expression he had never seen on her before. She looked relieved. Like something she had been holding for a very long time had finally been set down. Marcus didn't go to work on Wall Street. He didn't go to a consulting firm or a bank or any of the destinations that his business school professors implicitly aimed their students toward. He went back to construction. Not as a laborer this time. He took a job as a project manager trainee for a mid-size commercial contractor based in Cleveland called Meridian Build Group. The pay was modest. The hours were not. He was responsible for coordinating subcontractors, tracking budgets, managing timelines, interfacing with clients, and doing approximately 40 other things that weren't in the job description. He was exceptional at it. Not immediately, nobody is exceptional at anything immediately, but within 18 months Marcus had a reputation across every job site he touched for doing the one thing that is genuinely rare in construction. He did exactly what he said he was going to do, when he said he was going to do it, for the price he said it was going to cost. On projects he managed, the budget overruns that every contractor budgeted for almost as a matter of course simply didn't happen. Or happened far less. His timelines held. His subcontractor relationships were solid because he treated every trade partner as a partner rather than a subordinate, and because he paid his bills on time and resolved disputes fairly. His clients loved him. His bosses were somewhat less enthusiastic, because Marcus had a quality that made certain managers uncomfortable: he was usually right. Not arrogantly right. Not politically right. Just quietly, consistently, empirically right. He would flag an issue in a project plan or a contract term or a cost estimate, and the people above him would wave it away, and then 3 months later the thing Marcus had flagged would become the biggest problem on the project. This happened enough times that it became its own kind of reputation. The project managers who were smart enough to listen to Marcus found their projects running smoothly. The ones who weren't smart enough found themselves explaining overruns to furious clients at quarterly reviews. Marcus spent 8 years at Meridian Build Group. He was promoted 3 times. He managed progressively larger and more complex projects. By the end of his tenure he was running commercial developments worth $80 and $90 million. He had a staff of 12 direct reports and a network of subcontractor relationships that represented hundreds of millions in annual work. He also had an idea. The idea had been forming for a long time, years, really. It was born out of his father's death and everything he had learned since, from Pete Garza and his own education and 8 years of watching the construction industry from the inside. The idea was simple in concept and radical in practice. The construction industry was, and remains, one of the most fragmented, inefficient, and relationship-dependent industries in the American economy. A construction project of any significant size involves dozens of independent parties: owners, architects, engineers, general contractors, specialty subcontractors, material suppliers, equipment rental firms, inspectors, permitting agencies, all coordinating through a web of contracts and informal relationships and tribal knowledge that had barely changed in its fundamental architecture since the 19th century. The result was an industry where 50% of projects ran over budget, 66% ran behind schedule, and the margins for everyone involved were thin enough to be painful. Marcus believed there was a better way. He believed you could build a vertically integrated construction and real estate development company that controlled enough of the supply chain, contracting, key trade work, material sourcing, project management technology, and real estate development, to eliminate the coordination failures that made projects run over budget and over schedule. Not eliminate them entirely, but dramatically reduce them. Enough to generate margins that were genuinely healthy. Enough to build, retain, and properly compensate the kind of workforce that would keep the machine running well. He wrote the business plan over the course of 1 year. He wrote it in the evenings after work, at his kitchen table in the apartment he rented in a Cleveland suburb, a spare, clean apartment that reflected his habits: nothing wasted, nothing frivolous, everything in its place. He called the company Ironclad Development Group. He started it with $80,000, every dollar he had saved in 8 years of working, minus the money he had sent to his mother and spent on Janelle's college tuition. He was 31 years old. What happened next is the part of Marcus Wade's story that most people don't know. The narrative that usually gets told goes something like: he started a construction company, he worked hard, he became successful. And while all of that is true, it leaves out the decade of near misses, brutal setbacks, and strategic maneuvering that actually got him to the boardroom in Manhattan. Ironclad started small, as all real businesses do. First project, a commercial tenant improvement for a dental office in suburban Cleveland. Marcus did most of the work himself with 2 laborers he hired day rate and a plumber and electrician he'd worked with for years at Meridian. He came in under budget and 3 days ahead of schedule. The dentist referred him to her brother, who owned a chain of physical therapy clinics and needed 3 locations renovated simultaneously. That project was the first real test. Managing 3 sites simultaneously with a team that was still essentially a skeleton crew, with a budget that required Marcus to be correct about almost every cost assumption he'd made, with a client who was friendly but demanding and who called Marcus personally every Tuesday and Thursday to ask for updates. Marcus delivered. All 3 clinics came in on time. 2 came in under budget. The third had a structural surprise, an unexpected load-bearing wall that nobody's drawings had captured, and Marcus absorbed the cost overrun personally rather than pass it to the client. "I said it would cost X," he told his bookkeeper at the time, a part-time accountant named Brenda who worked for 3 small businesses out of her home. "So it costs X." Brenda looked at him like he had lost his mind. He had not lost his mind. He had made a decision. In an industry where trust was the ultimate currency, he was building a balance that would compound over time. The years that followed were years of grinding, methodical growth. Ironclad added people carefully, one at a time, always choosing cultural fit and trustworthiness alongside skill. Marcus remained hands-on in a way that was unusual for a CEO. He was still on job sites regularly, still reading contracts personally, still calling subcontractors directly when something wasn't going right. The company grew because the work was good and because word traveled in the contractor community the way it always does, slowly and then all at once. By year 5, Ironclad had annual revenues of $22 million. By year 7, $48 million. By year 9, they crossed $100 million for the first time, and Marcus moved the company's headquarters from Cleveland to Columbus. But Marcus had never stopped watching the larger landscape. And what he had been watching, for several years, was a company called Pinnacle Construction Holdings. Pinnacle was everything Marcus's father's death had taught him to be wary of. A large, publicly traded construction and real estate conglomerate, revenues over $900 million annually, that had built its empire through aggressive acquisition, financial engineering, and a culture that prioritized share price over craft and quarterly earnings over long-term relationship quality. Pinnacle had a reputation, in the circles Marcus ran in, for winning bids at below-market prices and then finding ways to squeeze margin out of the back end, cutting corners on materials, pressuring subcontractors until they either accepted unprofitable terms or walked, and when projects went sideways, redirecting blame to everyone downstream. Marcus had lost 3 bids to Pinnacle over the years, bids where he knew his approach was better and his outcome would have been better, but Pinnacle's initial number was simply lower. He had watched all 3 of those projects struggle. One went 16% over budget. One ended in litigation that lasted 4 years. One was, in Marcus's private assessment, a safety disaster waiting to happen, an assessment that was, 3 years later, unfortunately validated. The company that emerged from that tragedy had to pay significant damages and faced regulatory scrutiny. But it survived. Companies like Pinnacle, Marcus had observed, had a remarkable capacity to absorb the consequences of their own dysfunction without fundamentally changing. That was, he decided, a problem worth solving. He spent 2 years preparing. He brought in a financial advisor, a quietly brilliant woman named Constance Park, who had spent 15 years in private equity and had left to start her own boutique advisory firm because she found the ethics of large PE shops exhausting. Constance ran every scenario Marcus could imagine. She modeled the acquisition financing 17 different ways. She identified the weak points in Pinnacle's capital structure, an over-leveraged balance sheet, 2 major debt refinancing obligations coming due within 18 months, a board that had become complacent under a CEO, Gerald Moss, who had been in the role for 11 years and who had stopped challenging or being challenged by anything. Constance Park looked at all of it, sat across from Marcus in his Columbus office one October morning, and said, "This is achievable. It will require perfect timing, absolute discretion, and more patience than most people have." Marcus had said, "Tell me exactly what needs to happen." What followed was 18 months of the most careful, disciplined financial maneuvering Marcus had ever undertaken. Acting through a series of shell companies and investment vehicles that Constance had helped him establish, Marcus quietly accumulated a significant stake in Pinnacle's publicly traded equity. Not enough to trigger disclosure requirements, not yet, but enough to matter. He arranged financing with 2 private credit funds and a co-investor, a semi-retired developer from Atlanta named Calvin Reese who had known Marcus for 6 years and who had said, when Marcus outlined the plan, "Son, I have been waiting for someone to do exactly this to Pinnacle for a decade. I'm in." And then he waited. The catalyst came, as catalysts often do, from Pinnacle's own internal dysfunction. Gerald Moss's CFO resigned suddenly in the spring, citing personal reasons. The real reasons would not become public for another year, but they involved accounting irregularities that Moss had either overlooked or actively encouraged. The resignation spooked the debt markets at exactly the moment Pinnacle's refinancing was due. Their credit spread widened. Their stock dropped 17% in 3 weeks. Marcus and Constance moved. By the time the dust settled, through a combination of open market purchases, a privately negotiated block trade with a large institutional shareholder who was eager to exit, and the conversion of a debt instrument Constance had quietly arranged 6 months earlier, Marcus Wade and his associated investment vehicles controlled 23% of Pinnacle Construction Holdings' outstanding shares. He was the single largest shareholder in a $900 million company. Nobody at Pinnacle knew who he was. He had asked for a board meeting. His request came through a law firm, a large one, the kind of firm whose letterhead alone commanded attention. The request was formal, professional, and provided no indication of who the beneficial owner of the 23% position actually was. Gerald Moss and his board had agreed to the meeting, grudgingly and with a certain amount of barely concealed contempt. They had assigned it to a Thursday afternoon slot, the corporate equivalent of telling someone their appointment is right before closing time. Marcus had noted that. He noted everything. He had driven to New York from Columbus in his truck. He had worn his work boots. The offices of Pinnacle Construction Holdings occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. The lobby was the kind of lobby that is designed to make visitors feel that they are entering a place of significant consequence: soaring ceilings, dark marble, a reception desk that was basically a piece of sculpture, enormous black and white photography on the walls depicting construction projects of heroic scale. Marcus had been to 1,000 job sites. He had no particular feeling about the lobby. He checked in with the receptionist, accepted the visitor badge she printed for him, and took a seat in the waiting area. He was wearing dark work pants, a clean chambray shirt, and his steel-toed boots, the same brand his father had worn, a detail he was perfectly aware of. He had a beaten-up leather messenger bag and a stainless steel thermos of black coffee. He looked, to anyone who passed through that lobby that afternoon, like a project supervisor who had come to deliver a report to someone more important than himself. 2 people from Pinnacle's investor relations department came down to escort him up. They were polite in the clipped, efficient way of people who have been told to be professional but have not been told to be warm. In the elevator, one of them glanced at his boots with an expression that stopped just short of overt disdain. Marcus drank his coffee and said nothing. The boardroom was on the top floor, of course. A long, gleaming table of dark walnut that could seat 20. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of Midtown that was genuinely spectacular. Marcus took a moment to appreciate it, because he had an engineer's respect for the achievement of tall buildings even when the people inside them didn't deserve the view. The chairs were leather, substantial, the kind of chairs that announced that the people who sat in them made decisions of consequence. There were 9 people in the room. Gerald Moss sat at the head of the table, a man of about 65, silver-haired, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had once been athletic and retained the posture of that era even as the physicality faded. He had the deeply tanned face of someone who spent significant time on a golf course, and the carefully neutral expression of a man who had spent decades in corporate rooms managing impressions. To his right sat the company's remaining CFO, acting, in the wake of the previous one's departure, and to his left sat their general counsel, a compact woman of 50 named Harriet Cross who was, as Marcus knew from research, extremely competent and entirely loyal to Moss. Around the table were board members, a senior investment banker who had no doubt been brought in to manage the situation, and 2 people Marcus took to be security consultants or PR advisors. Nobody stood when Marcus walked in. Moss looked at him from the head of the table. A flicker of something crossed his face, confusion, maybe. He had been expecting, Marcus guessed, someone in a suit. A financial type. The kind of person who shows up to these meetings with a team and a presentation. Instead, a man in work boots. The laughter started softly. It wasn't loud, unified laughter, it was the boardroom version, which is somehow worse, the subtle, shared amusement conveyed in glances exchanged around the table, a half-smile here, a barely suppressed smirk there, one of the investment bankers actually turning his head away to compose himself. The acting CFO said something under his breath to the board member beside him. Whatever it was, the board member's smile widened. Marcus heard all of it. He set his messenger bag on the table, poured himself a fresh cup of coffee from his thermos, a deliberate gesture, slow and unhurried, and sat down in the chair he had been assigned, directly across from Moss. "Mr. Wade," Moss said. "Thank you for coming. I have to be honest with you, we were expecting representation from your investment group. We weren't anticipating he paused, searching for the appropriate euphemism, a personal appearance. "I prefer to handle certain things personally," Marcus said. "You'll find that's a consistent theme." His voice was completely even. Not aggressive, not defensive, not performing anything in particular. Just present. The room settled slightly, catching something in his tone that it hadn't expected. "Well," Moss said, in the tone of a man resuming control of a room he considered his property. "We've reviewed the position your entities have accumulated, and I want to be direct with you. The board is unified in its view that Pinnacle's current strategic direction." "I'd like to table that conversation for a moment," Marcus said. Moss stopped. In 20 years of running companies, Gerald Moss had not often been interrupted mid-sentence in his own boardroom. His expression shifted, the neutrality sharpening into something less managed. "I beg your pardon?" "I'd like to table the strategic direction conversation," Marcus repeated, calmly. "Before we get there, I think the room should have some context." He reached into his messenger bag and placed 3 documents on the table. They were not thick documents, 6 pages each, clean, well-organized, no cover presentation theater. He slid one toward Moss, one toward Harriet Cross, and left one in front of himself. "These are the materials you need to understand why I'm here and what I would like to discuss today. I'd ask that everyone take 10 minutes to review them before we proceed." Moss looked at the document in front of him without picking it up, as if touching it would concede something. Then, very deliberately, he looked back at Marcus. "We're aware of your position size, Mr. Wade. 23% is significant, but it is not controlling. The board has reviewed your acquisition carefully, and we have concerns about the sources of financing that I think." "The document answers those questions," Marcus said. "All of them. Take the 10 minutes." Something in the way he said it made Harriet Cross pick up her copy. She read the first page. Then she read it again. Then she looked up at Marcus with the first genuinely unguarded expression that had appeared on anyone's face in that room since he walked in. The document Harriet Cross was reading, that everyone in that room was now beginning to read, contained 4 sections. The first section was a complete disclosure of Marcus Wade's beneficial ownership, every entity, every share count, every financing arrangement, every co-investor. It was the kind of transparency that made financial lawyers look up from documents with raised eyebrows, because it went further than anything disclosure law required. The second section was a detailed financial analysis of Pinnacle's current position. Not the version that appeared in investor presentations, polished and optimistic, the real version, built from public filings, court records, industry data, and the analytical work that Constance Park had spent 18 months assembling. It showed, with clinical precision, that Pinnacle was 12 to 18 months from a liquidity crisis of genuine severity if nothing changed. The accounting issues from the departed CFO's era were outlined in a footnote that was 4 pages long. The third section was a history of Pinnacle's safety record over the previous decade. 23 regulatory violations. For fatalities on projects where subsequent investigation had identified management decisions as contributing factors. 11 settlements with injured workers or their families, all sealed, but cross-referenced with court dockets in enough detail that anyone reading understood what had happened. One of the 4 fatalities was on a project in Cleveland, in 2019. A beam failure. Insufficient bracing. The subcontractor had flagged the issue. The general contractor's site supervisor, employed by Pinnacle, had overridden the concern to stay on schedule. The worker's name was not Marcus's father. Marcus's father had died 25 years earlier, working for a different company. But Marcus had included this section not as a personal grievance. He had included it because it was true, and because it was relevant, and because he believed that the people in this room should have to sit with it in writing rather than have it remain something they had successfully avoided thinking about. The 4th section was a proposal. Not a hostile takeover proposal. Not an ultimatum. A proposal. Marcus outlined, in precise terms, what he believed Pinnacle could become under restructured leadership and governance, a company that combined the scale and market position it had built with an operational culture that actually matched what its marketing materials had always claimed. He outlined the specific leadership changes he considered essential, the governance reforms that would address the accounting vulnerabilities, and the operational investments that would address the safety culture failures. And at the bottom of the 4th section, in language that was unambiguous, he noted that his investment group had secured commitments from 3 additional institutional shareholders, representing, in aggregate, another 19% of the company's shares, who had agreed to support his proposals at the upcoming shareholder meeting. 42%. Gerald Moss had finished reading. His face, when he looked up, was a document of its own, the kind of face that has spent decades presenting one thing and is now, in spite of every effort, presenting another. The room was very quiet. "You're not here to negotiate," Moss said. His voice was different now. Stripped of the boardroom performance. Just a man's voice. "I'm here to make a transition as constructive as possible," Marcus said. "That's a choice I'm offering. It has to be accepted or declined in this room today." Harriet Cross, the general counsel, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Wade. The governance proposal in Section 4. You're not asking for the CEO position yourself. You're proposing an interim CEO and a search process." "That's correct. And the search parameters are outlined on page 5. A pause. Harriet Cross read page 5. She looked up. "These parameters describe you." Marcus looked at her steadily. "They describe the kind of leader this company needs. If the search finds someone more qualified, I'll support that appointment completely. I have no interest in a title. I have an interest in an outcome." There was a silence in the room that had a different texture than the silence before. The silence before had been the silence of people waiting for something. This silence was the silence of people absorbing something. Gerald Moss looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked at Marcus Wade, the man in the work boots, the thermos of coffee, the messenger bag, the absolute unperturbed patience, and Marcus watched him do the calculation. The calculation that every person in a position of defended power eventually does when the position becomes indefensible. The calculation that comes down, in the end, to 2 questions: what is possible, and what is the best version of that reality I can manage for myself? "I'd like to take a recess," Moss said. 30 minutes. Marcus looked at his watch. 20, he said. "I have a drive ahead of me." The board filed out. Marcus refilled his coffee from his thermos. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at Midtown Manhattan, the grid of it, the organized chaos, the 10,000 construction cranes and scaffolding rigs he could count from up here, the constant restless building and rebuilding of a city that never quite finished becoming whatever it was trying to be. He thought about his father's boots. He thought about his mother's face at his graduation. He thought about the worker in Cleveland, in 2019, who had flagged a safety concern that nobody listened to. He drank his coffee and waited. The board returned in 18 minutes. Gerald Moss sat back down at the head of the table. He had, Marcus noticed, the look of a man who had made peace with something, not happily, not entirely, but genuinely. There is a kind of dignity that becomes available to people in the moment they stop fighting the indefensible, and Moss, to his credit, had found it. The board has discussed your proposal, Moss said. We have concerns, legitimate ones, about governance process and timeline. But. He paused. We acknowledge that the position you've laid out is one that requires serious engagement rather than resistance. Harriet Cross placed a one-page term sheet on the table. We've drafted a framework. It's a starting point, not a conclusion. Marcus read it. It took him 4 minutes. He read carefully and he read quickly, and the two were not incompatible. He made 3 notations in pen in the margins. He slid it back across the table to Harriet. Those 3 points are non-negotiable, he said. Everything else is a conversation. She read his notations. The first was a governance amendment regarding safety reporting, mandatory external review, not internal. The second concerned the sealed settlements with injured workers. He wanted a fund established, administered independently, to provide additional support. The third was a personnel matter involving the site supervisor from the 2019 Cleveland project, who was still employed by the company. The third one made Moss's jaw tighten. But Harriet Cross looked at Marcus with something that might have been, in a different context, respect. These will require board ratification, she said. I understand the process, Marcus said. I'll give you 72 hours before I proceed through alternative channels. The 72 hours were not needed. The board called back in 31. The proxy vote was scheduled, as required by corporate governance. Marcus's 42%, combined with the proxy support of other shareholders who had been watching the situation develop in real time, the story, despite Marcus's best efforts at discretion, had begun to leak in the financial press, and the leaking had actually helped, because the picture emerging was of a shareholder activist with an unusually coherent and operational rather than purely financial agenda, totaled 58%. Gerald Moss announced his retirement 11 days after the boardroom meeting. The press release described it as planned. Nobody believed that, but nobody needed to say so. The board search committee, following the parameters in Marcus's 4th section, recommended Marcus Wade himself as CEO at the end of a process that lasted 6 weeks. It was, as search processes go, unusually brief, but the committee's report was thorough and the reasoning was documented. No other candidate they interviewed had the combination of operational expertise, financial sophistication, and apparent moral architecture that the company's situation required. Marcus accepted. He was 50 years old. He moved the CEO's office from the top floor to the 2nd floor, closer to the operations teams, the project managers, the people who were actually running jobs. He had the corner office converted into a conference room. He put a job site hard hat on his desk, next to a photograph of his parents. He wore his work boots on his first day as CEO of Pinnacle Construction Holdings. Not as a statement. Because they were what he wore to work. The culture change at Pinnacle did not happen overnight. Culture never changes overnight. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or talking about something that isn't really culture change. It happened through the accumulation of hundreds of decisions made consistently, over time, in a direction that had been clearly articulated and stubbornly maintained. Safety reviews that were actually independent. Subcontractor relationships that were rebuilt on terms both parties could sustain. Project managers who were taught that bringing a problem forward early was rewarded rather than punished. A workforce that, for the first time in a long time, felt that the people above them in the organizational chart were on the same side. 3 years into Marcus's tenure, Pinnacle had its best safety record since it went public. Its project on-time and on-budget metrics had improved by 31%, a number that sounds dry until you understand that on a portfolio of construction projects worth $900 million, 31% is an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of stress and disruption that simply didn't happen. Employee retention had improved significantly. Subcontractor relationships that had been adversarial had, in many cases, become genuine partnerships. Revenues grew. The stock price, after years of underperformance, recovered and then exceeded previous highs. Constance Park, who had joined the board as an independent director, sent Marcus a single-line text message the day the stock hit its new high: "Your father would have been proud." Marcus read it twice and set his phone face down on the desk. Then he put on his boots and went to a job site. I want to take a moment before we close this story. Because this is not just a story about a man who became a CEO. Those stories are everywhere. This is a story about something more specific and more important than that. This is a story about what it means to be seen incorrectly, and to allow it. Every person in that boardroom looked at Marcus Wade and constructed a complete narrative about who he was, what he was worth, and what they owed him based on a pair of boots. They told a story about him without asking a single question. They had decided, before he said a word, that he was beneath them, beneath their attention, their respect, their seriousness. And Marcus Wade, who had built his entire career on seeing things clearly, saw all of it. And he let them see what they wanted to see. Not because he was playing a trick. Because he understood something fundamental about human nature that the people in that room, despite all their sophistication, had never grasped: the assumptions you make about other people are always, first and last, about yourself. They laughed because of what they thought they were. Not because of what he was. But here is the other part of this story, the part that is actually meant for you, watching this right now, wherever you are in the world. You are probably not Marcus Wade. You have probably not spent 20 years quietly accumulating the resources to walk into a boardroom and restructure a $900 million company. Most of us haven't. Most of us will never be in that room. But every single one of us has been in a version of that room. Every single one of us has walked into a space, a school, a workplace, a family gathering, a social situation, and felt the particular cold sensation of being misjudged. Of being seen as less than we are. Of having someone's laughter or contempt or casual dismissal tell us that they have already decided our value, and they have decided it is low. And the question that Marcus Wade's story asks us is not, how do I win in that room? The question is, what are you building when no one is watching? Marcus did not walk into that boardroom confident because someone had told him he was valuable. He walked in confident because he knew, precisely and without exaggeration, exactly what he had built and what it was worth. He had no need for their recognition because he was not dependent on their recognition. His sense of himself did not require their validation to remain intact. That is the lesson. Not, work hard. Not, never give up. Those are true, but they are not sufficient. The lesson is, build something real, in private, over time, with standards you set for yourself, and let reality be the argument. Because reality is always, in the end, the argument that wins. The boots, by the way. After his first year as CEO, a reporter interviewing Marcus for a business magazine noticed the work boots under his desk, the same kind, worn and resold, and asked about them. Marcus looked down at them for a moment. "My father wore a pair just like these," he said. He called them his honest miles. The reporter asked if they were a reminder of where he came from. "No," Marcus said. "They're a reminder of who I am." If this story moved you, if some part of it reminded you of a moment when someone underestimated you, or a part of yourself you haven't shown the world yet, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Because we tell stories like this every single week, stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things by refusing to let the world's low opinion of them become their own. The boots are just boots. The work is everything. We'll see you in the next one.